Welcome to the Hangout Podcast. I'm your host, David Sharetta. On this show, we sit down for interesting and inspiring conversations. In this episode, I was privileged to have a conversation with Anita Fisher. Anita Fisher is an outspoken and powerful advocate for the rights of those diagnosed with mental illness. Her own work in this field began as a personal journey over 2 decades ago when her adult son, Pharaoh, was diagnosed with serious mental illness. This led to a complete transformation in their lives and in her own career as she moved from a successful banking career to becoming a mental health advocate. Now retired, she continues to advocate on behalf of those suffering with mental illness. We covered a wide range of topics, from mental illness to substance issues to homelessness, and Ms. Fisher has some strong and outspoken views on what she believes are some solutions from her own personal lived experience. To learn more about this remarkable woman and her work, visit FisherMHconsulting.com. That's FisherMHconsulting.com. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome, Ms. Fisher. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and for sharing your story.
Well, thank you, Dr. Schroeder, for the invite.
I thought it would be useful and helpful and instructive for our listeners if you would start at the beginning of your story, where you come from, what paths in your life have led you to this current moment, and then we can get into your advocacy work.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I'm originally a Northern California. I was actually born and raised in San Francisco, and my husband's job brought us to San Diego County 30 years ago now. I have 2 sons. They're 10 years apart in age, and the son that brings me to the work that I'm doing now is my oldest son. He was in middle school when we moved here. Not middle school. He was actually a junior in high school when we moved here. And I know that was a big transition for him. And but he did well. He graduated. We thought he was heading off to college, but something kind of changed for him. And I said, he said, I don't want to go to college. And I said, well, okay. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. I said, until you figure out what you want to do with your life, I said, at least you can be gaining some skills, going to school, whatever. And he went off to boot camp. And I remember going to his boot camp graduation in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and I saw a changed young man. I mean, those shoulders were back. He seemed focused on what he wanted to do with his life. And he ended up going to the AIT, they call it, I think it's advanced something training, but he ended up in the Medic Corps. And he was out of his class, only one of 2 recruits that went to Walter Reed. So his duty station was Walter Reed, and he was working in the hospital. And I said, wow, I never wanted to be a nurse, but my mom was a nurse, his grandmother. And I said, so you've kind of picked up that path, of going to work. And then I remember we did a family trip to Washington, D.C. Actually, I'd never been there before, and it was great for my younger son. He wrote a great report on all the things we saw and did in D.C., and I got to see him in action. Actually behind the nurses' station, I would get all these compliments, from a lot of the older his fellow, colleagues there, say, fine young man, great young man. And this is what I'd always heard about my son his whole life. His report cards used to say, joy to have in my class. He was a very good student. And so I always like to tell about and share who he was before his illness manifested. And then I'd say 2 years into his service, I was like, I used to say, 1 down, 1 to go, getting the other one ready and out of school. And we have that dream of being empty nesters, and all
Getting
that
your
good
RV.
stuff. Yes, yes, And we used to say that. We used to actually say, no, we're going to sell the house and live in a motorhome. You can't move back home if you don't know where we are, So we used to tease about that. But he came home one summer, and I noticed he was drinking very heavily. And it wasn't just that he was drinking, but it was just didn't make any sense. And he just seemed to be changed in some way. And I remember, I would just go to work as normal and come home, and in the evenings we'd have dinner and, catch up. But it was just something very different. And I didn't know what it was. And I remember that the morning that he was needed to leave to go back to Washington, I was going to drop him off at work. I worked downtown, so it was perfect. Drop him off at the airport. And he just was not ready. He was disorganized, that big duffel bag thing. I said, you better hurry up. So he's stuffing stuff in there. I said, excuse me, I noticed that, you've been drinking pretty heavy and probably some other stuff too. I'm sure marijuana may have been involved. And I said, you need to talk with your sergeant. You don't want to ruin. You already have steps. He's made up, grades. He's been promoted. He was a certified phlebotomist already. He was really doing well. And I said, they probably have a program. I'm sure you wouldn't be the first that might need some help,
right.
In this area. So I said, please talk with your sergeant and try to get some help. And I worried as a mom, you have this gut thing. I dropped him off at the airport. I went to work, and I just didn't feel, I said, make sure you call. I don't even think cell phones were kind of out then. So I said, when you get there, call and let us know that you made it back safely. And I remember about 2 days, I said, he never called. One day, then day 2, that evening, I got a call from his sergeant saying, do you know where your son is? I always say that was the beginning of our journey. After that, I remember that I spoke with her, and she said, yeah, this is so unusual for him. But she had a but in there, and she was saying there's a change. We started to see a change in him. She was thinking it was him hanging around with the wrong people, but it was the fact that he was hanging around with the ones who like to drink and what have you. And all that is very key to all of this, because having a diagnosed mental illness, you will find, I know the statistics say somewhere 40, 50%, I believe it's more 80%, they have some type of substance use disorder attached, which they call co-occurring disorder, where they're self-medicating with drugs or alcohol, to manage those symptoms. And so this all played a key because in the initial part of our thinking was that, oh my gosh, he's gone out there and becoming maybe an alcoholic or drugs or something like that.
And that wasn't part of your family pattern or history or anything.
No. And we just didn't see that coming. I'm not saying he was a perfect angel. I know that he, quote, experimented with marijuana in high school. So, that's not, but it was nothing like
he's not alone in that.
Yes, exactly. Right. So they did locate him. He was on the grounds, but he just wasn't reporting to work. And that's where they found him. They said, they counseled him and talked to him. And then the unthinkable really happened was when I got a call to say, your son is in the brig. I said, what?
So he had gotten to the military base.
Yes, he had got back to the hospital. And it wasn't even the way that it's set up, the hospital, and then they had like dormitory, that sat on the campus. So he had his own room. It wasn't like they were in bunks or anything. And they said he got into a fight with another soldier and they hit him with a bottle. It was just like, what? I didn't know my son had never been in a fight. Throughout school, he was always the guy. Everybody, wanted to be his friend, and all the girls liked him and all this kind of stuff. So this was so unusual. I said, no, and I thought, okay, I'm going into some kind of, alternate universe. I said, who is this? What is going on? Well, it gets worse. They said, well, yeah, he has enough with this. This is it. They're going to probably, put him out. And so I got a call from a JAG officer who said, I'm going to be representing your son. And they're going to want to court-martial him, and so I kind of told him his story, kind of just what I just shared to you, that birth through, the time that he entered. He says, you know what? I would like for you to come back and get on the stand. And at his hearing, I want you to share that with him, because we all saw what you are describing when he first came. And they flew me back to D.C., and I remember that when I sat there outside of that courtroom, my husband had a friend, a family friend who was an attorney in D.C., so he came with me. And he says, military law is different than civilian law, but I can at least listen and be here with you, So he came to the hearing with me. And I remember when I could tell he was a high-ranking person, walked in with two other guys, in their uniforms. And I could, he was actually sort of the head of the hospital, basically, on the military side. And he came up to me, and they called me, this is my second marriage. I'm Fisher, but his last name is Degree, and I will tell you about his father in a moment. That he said, Mrs. Degree, he says, I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances. He says, I remember your son when he came with the new recruits, and I remember that I could pick out the ones who were going to be an issue, and your son was not one of them. And he proved me wrong. He proved me right. And so I'm sorry to meet you. And I thought that was so kind of him to say that and make that, because I thought, they're all mad at him. He's, not lived up to what he should. So, and just kind of hold that thought. His name is Degree. I was married previously, his dad. And the reason why we divorced was because his behaviors changed. We married early in our 20s. And all of a sudden he was, this upstanding, he had been in the Navy. He worked for the Veterans Administration. We were just young couple. I had a little job at the bank, and, we were raising our baby, but something totally changed in him. And so hold that thought. And then I'm going to now jump back to where I was in the story with my sons. And there was a psychologist then that approached me as I was sitting there. He said, hello, Mrs. Degree. They kept calling me Degree. While your son was in the brig, I was seeing him, and he shared some things with me that leads me to believe that this is the beginning of a mental health issue. And I'm looking at him. He said, because we would say, it was probably drugs and alcohol that we know he was on as well, because they did test. He said, but he was in there long enough where it wasn't the drugs or alcohol. All that would have been out of his system. And he says, so when I'm done, you're going to hear me say some things while on the stand. And he said, when I am done, make sure you get a transcript, because we are trying to get a medical discharge. And all of this is just sort of shocking to me. I said, medical? What? And, and I'm just really still confused at this point. So we go into the hearing, and then they do eventually call this, they, talked about, of course, the incident, which was, again, totally out of character, surprise for my son.
An altercation.
Yes,
of some
yes.
sort, right?
Yes. And then they talked about this psychiatrist got on the stand, psychologist, and he said, as he's going through everything, talking and what he said, voices, that he was hearing voices, and that he said that he used to believe that when he was in his room, that anyone who passed the door was talking about him, and he said that the TV was doing things where he would throw his sheets over the TV. He was sharing this. He felt safe enough to share this with that. And I'm just sitting there in shock. And he said, I do not believe he is malingering. And I came to know that that is a word in the behavioral health world that means they're not faking. He's not malingering, and that I believe he has a schizophrenic form disorder. And I will never forget those words, schizophrenic form disorder. And I said, wait a minute, wait, that's that part, I've heard that. That's people with, that C word that I don't ever use anymore. Right. But, we used to say that, oh, that person is, the C word. And I said, wait a minute, no, this can't be it. And so he did not get the medical discharge. They kicked him out with a bad conduct discharge. I went back home, and it was going to be time to finish processing him out. And they were just going to send him back to San Diego. Of course, he wouldn't have any benefits whatsoever. And I thought, well, again, in my mind, that whole schizophrenic form disorder thing went to the back of my mind. And I was like, I always call it myself stigma. I said, well, it was just the drugs and alcohol. He's going to bring himself back here and get himself together. And, he has some skills. He's, he maybe can work for the blood bank or a hospital or something like that. And this is a blip. Excuse me. And he came back and we had that discussion, but something had changed. He literally couldn't get back to San Diego. He missed his flight. They put him on a bus. He went back to the base. They said, no, you're not supposed to be here. So they got him a bus ticket and put him on a bus. I'm surprised he made it back across the country.
That's a lot of bus stops. Right?
Yes, he came. He literally had lost half of his things. And he was so disruptive that one thing I remember is that there was this hotel that was near the bus station called the Pickwick. And I remember that I said, let's just get him a room there. We need to figure this out and process. By this point, I have a 14-year-old at home, and I'm like, what kind of chaos is coming in here? So, we put him there. He was there for a little while. Then we had him come home, and, with rules, no drinking, of course, no drugs, and you need to, have a purpose, to goals to set. And he would say all the right things, but I just still noticed that there was something. And then my younger son said to us one day, he said, he does some strange things. He called the fire department showed up at the house when you guys were at work. It was like he was out of school at that time during a break. And he said that sometimes he's screaming in his room. And I said, why didn't you tell us? Well, that was his hero, his big brother, and he, didn't want to get him in trouble. And I said, well, you need to tell us. And then that stuff about schizophrenic form started. So I started doing research. We had a computer, wasn't a lot on it at that time, but, I found enough to, where I remember seeing a checklist for schizophrenia, and I could check off every box. And I remember even showing it to my younger son. I said, well, I believe that this is what happened. And I did get that transcript as well, because that's going to be very important to this journey, is me having that transcript from his court martial. And so it started, we were just on this. I didn't know where turn. I just, he was having all these different, we were arguments and screaming and, what is wrong with you? And you need to, okay, I'm going to put you out. And I remember, I thought that threat would definitely straighten him up, but it didn't.
Right.
And I remember, I said, leave, you have to leave the house. My husband, we're having discussions, and he's raised him since he was 6. That is his son. We never say step anything. Right. And he loves and adores him to this day. Each other, they do love and adore each other to this day. And but he was right there, he said, no, we're not having that in this house, And so I remember that it was like a Friday, Thursday or Friday, and I'm like, oh, it's going to be cold out there. He'll be back and want to straighten up. And then I'm to my husband at 5 a.m. that Saturday morning, let's go look for him. I knew he had ended up downtown somewhere. And we went to look for him. And I remember that I was walking and I saw this group of kind of young people. And I said, do you know a guy who has, unusual name named Pharaoh? He said, yeah. You see those boots sticking out of that doorway? That's him. I just saw, and I didn't recognize the boots. I didn't, and so I walked down there. My husband, who had broke his ankle, was driving, and I'm walking. And sure enough, that was him laying in a doorway. And I said, this is not, come on, you need to, So he agreed to come. And I remember he was filthy, dirty. And I remember making him stand in the garage, strip naked, and throw everything in the garbage can. And, I gave him a towel, and I remember, making him come and shower and things. And I thought, okay, maybe we can start this. We can try this again. Well, it didn't work. And he stayed the weekend. I said, we need to go to a program. Then we were looking for drug and alcohol programs, right?
Because you weren't thinking mental.
No, I had read, I had seen it. I was still saying, but no, this can't be. You have to be born with this. That's what I was saying in my head. He doesn't just develop at 21 years old. And so I did try to point towards the substance use. So we saw these programs that were listed, residential. I remember we would go, he would go through the orientation part and whatever you have to do, the rules and regulation. And then he would, I don't want to be here. Or I said, well, you need to pick something, because I was frustrated by this point because you need some help, right? So finally, it took an arrest. He was arrested because back then crack cocaine was the drug of choice in the streets at that time. And they had mandatory sentencing. So he would end up in jail for facilitating a drug buy or under the influence or, what was the third one that he would always get arrested for? Probably between those two. And then it would be strike, for him being under the influence. Because I was like, no drug dealer, that his state of mind, we would always drive. My husband worked downtown. We would drive through the streets looking, we would find him and, but he wouldn't come in for help. I soon learned that he didn't realize he was sick. He has an added feature to his now schizophrenia diagnosis of anosognosia, the lack of insight. And that is a clinical term now. A Dr. Javier Amador, he has a great book that we always recommended. And I'll get to how I got to NAMI. And during this period, I finally said, okay, we have to now figure out this whole mental illness thing, this mental, and understand it. And I kept seeing in looking for help, this NAMI, NAMI, National Alliance on for the Mentally Ill, even back then. And I called them one day, just desperate, a desperate mother. And I remember I was in tears and I said, this is what's been happening. I gave them the whole story and I thought they were going to say, oh, sorry, ma'am, this is too hard for us or something,
right.
And they said, we understand. Now, remember, that was a dad that answered the phone. I eventually met him later. But he says, I understand. I have a loved one and we've been through some of what you've mentioned. You need to take this class. And he said, it's called Family to Family. And he says, it's 12 weeks. I said, excuse me. I said, a class. I said, no, sir. I said, I need help. I need to know, how do I get my son into treatment? Everybody keeps telling me I can't just call and have him picked up like, when I used to watch TV, Dr. Kildare or whoever it was, right. You saw the white, ambulance come with the red, cross on it. And they had that little button down, and they would come and take the person to a place for help. I said, where's that number?
Yeah.
And, but it didn't exist. And in some cases, rightfully so, that was the old way that they did it,
Right.
the insane asylums of yesteryear.
Without consent.
Yes. And So we did take the class because even my husband and I were struggling too, and how we're looking at this, a man's, and then the mom, and so we took that 12-week class. It was Saturday mornings, 2.5 hours. We were in the room with 16 other family members. And that was the first time that I realized, wait, we're not alone. I realized that this wasn't, I even thought, I said, is this something that just happens to Black people? I really thought that this was something rare, that was happening. And I learned, through that class, it was amazing because it taught us that my son didn't have a character flaw, that it truly was a medical condition affecting his brain, that treatment was that in finding the right treatment, that he could live a quality life. And that's what, then it became a mission from that class. And also in that class, the two teachers approached me and I said, oh, am I talking too much or what? But they kind of, during a break, and they said, this class, just like we're mothers and we were taught and certified to teach this, it's always taught by peers. It's taught by people with the same lived experience. And we think you'd be a good teacher. And I was like, I have a demanding, full-time job at the bank. I was a VP. I think, yeah, I was, a manager. And I was like, I just, I don't know if I would have time for that, whatever. But I said, okay, put my name on the list. And I remember that I did go to the certification training. And I met even more people who were, again, like me. They were family members. Some were siblings, some were parents, some were, grandparents who had taken the course and they were being trained to teach it in their communities or wherever. So it just then started, something grew in me at that time. I was like, I think I'd been in banking by this point 30 years. I was a VP and a business systems analyst, and I worked for a Union Bank of California then. That's the name, went back and forth a few times. And I was like set, ready to cruise on into retirement, right? But I remember that I was joined the board of NAMI San Diego. And I was like, okay, it's something, I want to do this. I need to be here. I want to talk to especially my community. I wanted to speak to the African-American community about mental health. We treated it differently. It was a secret. There's movies that I can identify where that person with mental illness was there in the family. You saw them in the back room upstairs, but they took care of them, but no, there is a different kind of help. There is a way where that person can live, again, a good quality life. And I wanted to bring all this to whoever, not, my community and whoever. And so I remember asking the executive director, I said, I don't know what with what my background is, what I would bring here, but if there's ever a job, just, and they had received a contract for where they were going to be able to do that course, and they needed a program manager. And I quit my job, at the bank, yes, with a long discussion with my husband, and I did a spreadsheet and everything, to show him.
Comparing the numbers.
Yes, how much I could make, I needed to make, actually, to make things. And I always am grateful to my husband that he agreed. He said, I knew that you needed to do something with this. I said, I don't have the heart to even go to work anymore. This is what I need to do. So I did become that family-to-family teacher, and now I've been teaching that course for still 20 years. Even when I became the education director at NAMI San Diego, every year at least once I taught in person that now it's 8 weeks, but that course for families. I facilitate for support groups. I still do that. I still I'm what they call a state trainer. So I now train other people to do it through the state. I serve on the NAMI California board. I've done things through the national. I might as well have a NAMI, tattoo, yes, because I'm very much ingrained in it, even though I retired in 2018. And now I want to go back again and talk about my son and why. A lot of this, too, is because when he started to go to jail and then prison, Because of that mandatory sentencing, he didn't rape, kill, beat, nothing, anybody. He was sitting in prison with hardened criminals because he was addicted to drugs and had a mental illness that was untreated, and that it was untreated in a way where I couldn't get him into, he had to agree. He had rights, and we're going to talk about rights in a minute. And I was like, I believe nobody can believe more in rights and freedoms than a Black woman, a person. And, but when it is harmful to you, there is a point in time where involuntary treatment is needed. And my son would hit every roadblock, but there would be a time once he was in the system, he would be in the mental health units. So thank God the prisons did have units designated for individuals like that. And I remember even serving on a state committee with a family members with the California Department of Corrections. They were doing kind of to say, how can we serve this population better? Not like, when they're released, no one knows when they're released, what time, what day, and they drop them off at a bus stop, sometimes in another city. I've heard horror stories over the years. It has gotten much, much better. Warm handoffs to reentry programs and things. I actually was appointed by Governor Newsom to the Council on Criminal Justice and Behavioral Health. We just sunsetted, though, that committee. It had been around for over 10 years, but we, because I wanted to bring that family member voice. Everything I do is about bringing the family perspective. So that our stories, because I hear them. I have 3 calls right now that I'm going to have to return this afternoon from family members who may have been in a class or a group and they're in crisis. Yes, there are crisis numbers, to call. There's the accessing crisis line and all of that. But sometimes you need to talk with that person to help you strategize that's been in the trench, and that's what I do. I am not a helpline. I do have a little website and I have a phone number and so that people can find me. But that was not initially my intent. I wanted to be a voice of the family to the treatment community, the behavioral health community. That's why I have served on boards, several boards, Parents for Addiction Treatment and Healing, a wonderful organization that helped because before mental illness and substance use disorder was separate. You have to go down this path or you have to be clean and sober before you can treat this and all of that. Well, they finally, merged the two and realized they need to treat both together. But that organization, they now do the Narcan distribution. I serve on the Community Research Foundation, which is a provider here in San Diego County of behavioral health services. And, but it's always, again, about bringing that family member voice. My son has had periods of what they call recovery, recovery, not cure. There's no cure, but recovery means that he is maintaining his medication regimen. He got a lot of great peer training, meaning there's a peer-to-peer course that NAMI offers that tells them how to live successfully with what they have, how to set themselves up for success and live that quality life that I've always wanted for both my children, right? He became a mentor. He became a secretary at his NA group. He, when NAMI San Diego had a helpline contract, he was one of the first hired, not because of me, but on his own, and he worked on that helpline. And I was like, okay, thank God we've got there. This is over. He's probably close to 30 years old at this point because it started at 21 and we jail, prison, homelessness, all of that. And finally, it seems like we were on that, upward, and we're over. He understands it all now. Well, anytime he stops his medication, we're back at square one. And square one is that anosognosia. I'm not sick. I don't need help. That's the name of the book, Dr. Javier Amador's book. And he realized his brother had schizophrenia as well. And he realized, I'm a clinician. I am a psychologist. You know, he's been on CNN and everywhere, and I can't, you know, even get my brother, you know, what am I not doing right? And he realized it was how he was talking to his brother. And he developed the LEAP method. That stands for listen, empathize, agree, and part. And it's a wonderful book, and it can work not just with mental health.
I'm just saying with anything.
Yes, with anything, exactly. But that is a method he said that, you know, can work very well with individuals, you know, in you said in a lot of different situations. But the anosognosia part, that's what he realized that his brother, the lack of insight, and he said there's a part of the brain that can be affected, and it could be an accident. He said that he worked with patients who had traumatic brain injuries, and one gentleman has lost his arm in an accident, and didn't believe the arm was gone because that part of his brain had been damaged in the accident. And he says, well, then how come you can't write? Well, then write us a note. And he says, you guys have my arm tied down. He kept giving excuses. Well, this is the same thing that we sometimes, when someone with mental illness has anosognosia as well, those excuses. And we would hear that from my son. We would say, but look what you just did. You were, you know, this. And he was like, well, you guys that was in the past. Or, you know, it seemed to be trying to justify, the behavior.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll link to the book as well in the show notes.
Oh, great.
I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so, and even though I was like, but remember, you used to get up. My son was always meticulous about how he looked, his dress, get his hair cut every week and get the little lines in it. You know, the tennis shoes match the hat. And, you know, I remember he'd go shopping and get all the little polo shirts to wear to work so he looked professional. And, you know, and then here's someone that wouldn't bathe for a week and had filthy clothes on and ragged clothes that I don't even know where they would come from sometimes, and basically live in the street. I don't know how many times, I can't even tell you how many times my son has lived in the street or in Balboa Park. You know, and it would be because we would try to find him, or he would eventually call when he would say, I food or something. And, you know, I would go and we would try to take him food and try to get him to come off of the streets and get help. And my frustration, all of these years, it's been it's been 25 years now, because he just turned 47 years old, April 22nd. And all of these years, my biggest frustration has been that, well, we can't force him. He has to, you know, ask for help. We have a lot of wonderful, great, I know them all because I worked within the system under NAMI. So I know all of the resources. I know the programs. But unless that person willingly, you know, goes in and raises their hand, it doesn't work. Yes, you can call for PERT. I'm on the PERT board too, the advisory board, and I speak at the PERT academies, you know, the psychiatric emergency response team. But again, a lot of times, unless that person is exhibiting a danger to self or others at that moment in time, that law enforcement may be there with or without a clinician, that person may be left behind. And you know, with you know, they can promise. My son would do that. Oh, yeah, I'll call my doctor. Yeah, I'll take my med.
And they just leave them.
And they'd leave them. Yeah. And so this is a lot of the advocacy work that I'm doing right now with some families from across the state, some that I'd never met in person before to this day. But Care Court was a part of that. That was families frustrated saying, you know, they're skirting around that gravely disabled, you know, gravely disabled, the law, you know, the welfare institution codes. Yeah. Those codes are out there that says if a person is unable to provide food, shelter, you know, all of that. And we said, look, on the street, like you just said, the person you may almost ran over this morning. Why is that person in that alley? They obviously are gravely disabled. So why hasn't someone come and in a client-centered, compassionate way, given them the services they need, even if it's involuntary? Because once my son is stabilized involuntarily, guess what? Then he's able to walk out into the world and live a semi-independent life. I always put semi in there. But he functions, his brain still. I said, all the stuff you've been through, I'm surprised that when he is, stable in that medication. I remember they used to call it a chemical imbalance. I don't hear them refer to it like that before, but it's always made it easier for me to comprehend what's going on in the brain, and that certain levels are off. And just like I have prediabetes or I take medication for something, that's because something is off in my body and I need it to stabilize it. And I don't think my family, if I decided, I don't like this medicine, makes me gain weight, so I don't want to take it. I don't think they would probably be able to involuntarily take me to a hospital if it was killing me. And this is the thing, that when my son is off of his medication and in the streets, I have to plan a funeral. I said this during an interview recently. I don't know if it was on the 60 Minutes one about Care Court, but I remember that many families say that. They say, I don't know if they're going to be, and I have attended far too many funerals of people dying before their family, their parents, just because they couldn't get them help, whether it was an overdose or whether it was, something they did. I remember a young woman here in San Diego who I knew from working with her. She was a peer. That's how we normally, distinguish family member or a peer, person with lived experience. And her symptoms returned, and she was driving her car, and she ended up in Los Angeles, and the police felt threatened. They shot. She's dead, and she was a mom. There's been horror stories. They don't always get the. No one knows the backstory. She had her law degree. No one knows who she was. They only see the sensational story. So normally, what you see in the paper about mental illness. I have a dear mom friend that I knew for over 10 years that I met in she's actually wanted me to start a support group for people who have a loved one with mental illness in jail or prison. And I used to do the group, and she was sort of the person that brought in all the moms that she'd meet in the visiting rooms. Her son was in prison, and because of something he did while in psychosis. And he got out. She was so happy. And unfortunately, in 2023, he took her life. Those are stories that, no, and I don't want to put that out there. Statistically, people with mental illness are more likely to have violence against them. So it's not. But I want to just say, we can't hide the fact that untreated mental illness can be, yes, a danger to self or others, if it's not. So why do we fight so hard against involuntary treatment? No, if someone has a meltdown, oh my God, I'm so sick, no one's going to call the PERT team on you. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, okay, this is getting dangerous for this person. This person has been out in the streets, no telling what kind of disease they're picking up out here. They're not eating. My son has been skeletal. I remember going to visit him in jail, and every jail or prison he's ever been in, except, I'll tell you about them putting him in Pelican Bay. I have gone to visit him because I wanted him to know he has a loving family behind him. He shouldn't be here. He used to even say that once he would get stable on medication and he might be going to a group, people would say, well, how did you get here? I know why I'm here. I'm a gang member or something. But how did you end up here with these, in this place, based on just how you speak, what you talk about, your life. And that is unfortunate. And so my fight has been, one, to keep him out of a jail or a prison, but it doesn't happen. In the last 3 years, he's been in jail when he stopped his medication. We just came out of a crisis situation with him, and he is also, I was one of the first, probably, I believe they said their initial care court petitions were 50 in 2023, October 2023, when it started here in San Diego County. And I was sure I was one of those first 50, because on Thanksgiving Eve of that year, I was driving downtown to the courthouse. I wanted to hand deliver that petition and get it filed because he was decompensating. I was like, maybe we can catch him this time. It's in the early stages, but unfortunately, that's not what happens. He didn't end up being caught in time. He was evicted from his lovely apartment in Little Italy because he had stopped his meds. He had and deteriorated, and he was back on the streets. And so wait, you want me to stop?
No,
Just
keep going.
stop me.
You good? You're
Okay.
great.
And unfortunately, the program has not worked out. That's not what I advocated for. And many, many, many families across the state. As a matter of fact, there are two bills that we are that are right now in the legislature to make some amendments to the CARE Act and the gravely disabled law, the Latterman Peck, just short, they call it LPS law, because it is still not working for people with SMI, and that's a designation. You know, there's a spectrum of mental illness, and we're talking about the people who end up here on that high end that are considered to have serious mental illness, and that's where my son sits when he is not on his medication. When he is on his medication, guess what? He's way down here in that early in the very low range where a person might not even know. You know, sitting and talking with him would not know that he is diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
So, thank you for sharing that impactful and ongoing story, right? Because
we're in it.
We're in
Still,
it. We're in
right
it
now.
right? Just coming out of crisis, and I'd imagine that as a family, you live with the hope and the fear and the trepidation all at the same time at all time. How have your extended family members and or neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues reacted, and what has that been like? I think I saw you on one of the YouTube interviews that you did talk about, you know, if your son had an injury and broke his leg, someone would come over with a casserole for you and, hey, what can I do? And can I drive him to his next appointment? Very different in a situation like that. Talk to us a little bit about what that experience has been like, perhaps the stigma coming to grips.
Yeah. When we first moved here, the house that we lived in was in a cul-de-sac. And I remember, so everything was very visible that when we did have to call for the PERT team, there was 1, 2, 3, 4 sheriff's cars, you know, kind of just surrounding and I said, oh my God, the neighbor's going to say, what kind of people are they? You know, well, who's living over there that requires all this police? And then I remember that I came out of the house and the next door neighbor, I said, you probably saw the police out here and, you know, he has a mental illness. She said, oh, girl, I got mental illness all throughout my family, you know. So that was, you know, for that one, I was like, okay, see, you never know. I probably should have been talking to her a long time ago about it because she had a lot of experience in her family. And as far as our family, my sister, very close sister, brother, you know, nephews and whatever, because of my education through that class and my work at NAMI, and they knew I you know, changed, you know, careers and all of that, I educated my family. So we have holiday pictures where sometimes he looks well and sometimes not so well, but he's in that picture and everyone embraces him. No, he's not in the room. He's not in the back room. And he will go and come and I'll tell them, I say, you know, Pharaoh's not doing so well right now. Like if it's my turn to host Thanksgiving, he will come and go as he wants. He may come out and eat with us, and then he might go in the room. He doesn't live with us anymore now, and I've made that kind of he can always spend the night maybe if he's well. But I realize that for my husband and we're both retired, peace of mind, he can't live at home. I believe that is something I'm preparing him for the future when we're not here. Right. That he has to know how to not manipulate, but know how to navigate, I'm trying to say, the system and live in, and that's why he's living where he is now, but I want to kind of backtrack on something you said earlier about, those emotions that I have to live with, those three. There is a study done by the National Association of Caregivers finding, they did it in 2016, of people like us. Are we caregivers or not? There's not the ADLs and all of that. But the name of the report at the end, they want to say, what are we going to name this? They called it On Pins and Needles. And that is such a true statement. Yes, they said 8.3 million people like me that I just described my story in some variation that are out here in America. I'm living like this. So we do live that way. But also kind of into your current question, about the stigma, the self-stigma, the stigma around it. I am all about, I've talked at churches. I am always out there, showing that this is a human condition. We wouldn't punish someone for having cancer and then cancer coming back, or, sits in remission and comes back again. We have to show that. And I said, and yeah, a lot of times that I can be frustrated still, or like, come on, not again. Why? You know what happens when you stop your meds. So I can get frustrated as well with that, because I know that it's going to be bad for him, that he is going to decompensate to a point. But I still, that's why I still do what I do. As long as I can talk and stand, I will be, talking about this to make it normal, to show the world or the community that many of those people, and when I talk to law enforcement, like I'm going to be talking to law enforcement tomorrow, and I always want to put that family face. I say, I have a slideshow that I use, and one of them is my son doing well. He has a great video out there, himself telling his story that he did for the county. And I show that. And then I say, now, this is who you're probably going to meet. And I said, this is when he stops his meds and he's on the streets. But I want you to remember that person probably has a family just like his. Probably a mom, a dad, a sister, a brother, someone out there, grandparents, that are looking for them maybe, or them just not understanding that family wants to be a support and help to them. And I can see the light bulbs. I can see it, when I look in their eyes. And we do a panel actually at the PERT Academy of people with lived experience that have had law enforcement contact, and family members like myself, someone who lost their loved one, actually her husband, to suicide. And what you come up on, and I know that it really makes a difference for them to see the backstory in that person, like we all have a backstory. And so that is what, the purpose of us doing that lived experience panel, because they are the first responders, law enforcement. I never thought, I told you, the guys in the white jacket, I thought though they would be the first responders, but it is not. It is law enforcement. Yes.
Are there states, perhaps municipalities, that do a better job than?
Well, I have been to many NAMI national conferences, and we speak and share, and our topics are around all of that. I think it's a struggle across the country. Yeah. And even here, we now have a mobile crisis response team that does not involve law enforcement here in San Diego. It is, they do come in, I think, a SUV or a van or something. But the person cannot be, they have to absolutely not need any kind of restraint, if you will. And by the time someone meets the criteria of a danger to self or others, that's unfortunate. That's what I'm saying. Why do we treat them at stage 4 instead of here in the beginning, stage? So a lot of times you do need law enforcement for that, for the safety of everyone.
That's my understanding is that's the kind of the stage that would trigger like a 72-hour hold or something, right?
Yes.
That's kind of always what you hear, right?
Yes.
Danger to yourself or others.
Yes.
72-hour hold, and then that's it.
Yeah. And where is that? And that's where some of the other programs, and even when I was at NAMI, I was a program manager for the NAMI portion of a program that met people in that San Diego County Psychiatric Hospital. The program is still there, where they peers, and they would say, hey, I've been here, and I can help you when you get ready to leave. Our program can walk out the door with you, basically. That's something that wouldn't happen. Like I said, instead of saying, okay, discharge, here you go. Here's a paper with all these things you got to do. Go to an appointment here, go get your medicine there, and leave that to a person that is coming out. Like they said, someone with the broken leg or just some surgery, and someone's going to say, now, come on, I'll help you with your appointments. I'm bringing the casserole, whatever. That doesn't happen in mental health, and so they are developing a lot of programs that are supporting that transition from a hospital, using peer supports, which I wholeheartedly, I know that was the most effective, in addition to his medication, was peer supports and things like that, where you're really, you have that backup.
So what the care courts, you hear Governor Newsom talk about that a lot. My very, very basic understanding of, and I'm not even sure it's that accurate, but some of the narrative says that before the Reagan administration, there were, I don't know, I'm going to call it just to say for a round number, 100,000 beds for mental illness in the state of California. And then by the time the Reagan administration finished, I don't know, let's say it went down by 90% or something. Mm-hmm. That's when the state was maybe half the population that it is now. Mm-hmm. What do the care courts do, and how can they fit into that? And then what more do we need, apart from, in addition to your stance on the involuntary stage coming way earlier? Mm-hmm. What else do we need?
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because, that is what happened. Of course, when they closed those facilities, which a lot of them were horrible, right, and they weren't doing what they should have been doing. What we saw in the movies. But those services were supposed to transition into the community. They were supposed to be a nice community mental health clinic or place for people, all spread around, that no one could be on the streets. It never happened, right? So that's one thing. It never happened. Even with the Mental Health Services Act, that was supposed to be a great deal. That's the millionaire's tax, that 1% over $1 million that goes into behavioral health services. That was supposed to help with that. And I'm not even saying that we need, when we say beds, not somewhere that, okay, you messed up 3 times, we're going to lock you away now forever. You can't live in the community. No. It should be community-based services. And I like to, I think, in a home environment, a home-like environment. But it's all about, yes, funding. And it's really scary right now, because a lot of things that used to trickle down that would end up from federal to state into the communities that could help with that, a lot of that is going away. Helping with housing, like building having an apartment complex. My thing is having taking a hotel and, remodeling it to housing where, I don't think grown people should ever have to share a room. I think that, so everyone needs their privacy. I think they should be little nice studios within, the building that I tell you my son lives in now. The only thing missing inside, it's great. It's walk out the door. That's a whole different situation, but there's no services in the building. That is not a building. That's a low income housing structure. But if they put the services in there, that would be a perfect place. Someone that could have, I think he didn't check in today.
Keep a watchful eye.
Yeah, keep a watchful eye. Something's going on there. Maybe we need to call his case manager, his counselor, a wraparound. But they still live and they can go and come as they please, Someone, though, is keeping an eye. That, to me, is the ideal situation. Client-centered, but the clinical services and the supports are still right there on site. And kind of tying that into care court. Care court is, I think the rest of there were like 6-8 counties that started it in 2023. Then the following year is when the rest of the states, and it's basically has no teeth. Let's put it like that. Meaning there's a judge, there's the judge's staff, there's the county people, there's a public defender that represents my son, and they have a team. One of the provider organizations here does the outreach and whatever work. And they're wonderful. I always want to say that the people who do the work on the ground, I am never complaining about them. They can only do and work with what they have.
Sure.
But the structure of the program is not what it was supposed to be. Like I said, we were on that 60 Minutes interview.
Yeah.
And one thing that I said, I hope I never have to use it. And it was a totally different program that I had read about when I did that interview in maybe the spring of 2023, and what rolled out in October of 2023, something totally different. It turned into another voluntary program.
And what do you think is behind that change? Just that people don't want to get sued, or it's not a good look?
Right. Yeah, there's a very strong disability rights in the state of California, and they stand on the nobody should do anything involuntarily. So they go in, they're lawyers, the disability, they have a lot of lawyers. We're just family members, Some people are lawyers too that are in the family member, which is why some of the amendments that we have been trying to put forth, that's who helps us craft all that. In a group that I'm in, a statewide gravely disabled work group. And they're providers, they're, a lot of people that see what needs to happen. So we have to try to go back now legislatively and make it have some more teeth, but that's what we normally are fighting. They are very much against. Here in San Diego County, there's a patient advocacy organization, lawyers and staff that will go into the hospitals where people are on a conservatorship, because my son was on a conservatorship once, which he needed. Right. And I said, just maybe 6 months, 3 months. No. He was there maybe 30 days, but because he was doing so well, they were able to convince the conservatorship, whatever judge, that he should be released. He was back in the streets within 4 weeks.
I think the Britney Spears thing, it just occurred to me as you were saying that, it probably didn't do the whole conservatorship conversation much good, right? I can't comment on her case, right. But that brings everybody up into everybody's minds like, oh, it's a bad thing. Conservatorship is bad, that's restricting someone's freedom. But as you describe in your son's case, like, as parents, you're not going to let when your child was young and vulnerable, you're not going to let them just wander around in traffic. You have to pull them back, and then you don't just keep them out of traffic one day. You keep them out of traffic until they're old enough to where they can learn some of those things.
Right.
That gradual release.
Yeah. And she wasn't locked away anywhere either. She still lived on her own. She had the fact, I said she has money, and it was guardrails that saved her. I don't know how, she's doing now, but I would love to know, but it may not be good. But that is what, that's the part right there. I said, but you don't understand, especially when you have a historical look at, I told you 25 years. So I know, I can look in his eyes and know. In the beginning. Yeah. But I said, oh no, did he stop? And then I'll ask my husband, like if when he was, living at home, And even if my son was visiting or something, and I'd say, "Are you noticing?" It kind of, because he starts to pull away. You could pass him in the kitchen or the hallway, no eye contact. And he's a very, he has a very good sense of humor. So he's going to say something funny, or we say, "Mom, you want to watch a movie?" Or, whatever, and all of the things that he wants. And this has to be a mind that is not functioning, well. All the things he wants, he can actually have if he was just stay in treatment. And I know the medication side effects are horrible. I've heard it from many people. My staff, when I worked for NAMI, I had up to 15 people before I left. And they were all peers or family members like myself. And so many, they had master's degrees, they were married, they had children. But they said, "Yep, I carry around 15, 20 pounds of extra weight, but I have a life."
Right.
Some people can make that distinction. Right. People with anosognosia cannot.
Right.
And so he could have all the things, he can, a wife, a girlfriend, children, and have a quality life, but his mind can't. And I said, after 25 years, don't you think that maybe a conservatorship for him to stay on his meds? That's all he needs, right, is a conservatorship, kind of like the Britney Spears one. Hers was about money, though, because she had a lot of money. Yeah. But for him, it would be that they would never see him in a jail again. They would never, just like my younger son, never been to jail, never been arrested, never, he was that kid, he was that man. But never would he have ever hit the jail or prison. He probably has a rap sheet the length of this room, but it was all behind whenever he was. And I said, "You notice he never gets arrested when he's on his meds?" So, there's so many historical things that can be used to me to say, yeah, we've given you a whole bunch of chances to do it voluntarily. And it seems like you won't, and we ending up back at the same spot again. We're going to help you out with that.
How much of your conversation intersect with entities who are working to try to address the issue, which seems almost unaddressable, of homelessness? Mm-hmm. Just in our county, our state, and our country. Mm-hmm. Because you described Pharaoh's journey, and yeah, recursively involved homelessness. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that extrapolating from that, there are 5,000 cases down the hill from here that are very similar.
Right, right.
How much of the work that you've seen of, let's say, the city of San Diego trying to address homelessness also intersects with like a NAMI and that work?
Yeah.
Like understanding, I know you're working with training PERT, that's part of it, but from a solution standpoint.
Yeah, all of it intersects. The programs at NAMI opened up a clubhouse here downtown, not too far from here, that is for people who are homeless that may have mental health issues. They can come in there. They even do the showers. They do. So NAMI has become a solutions base. It used to be education, advocacy, and
like support groups.
Yes, right? and things. But now they're in the community doing the work. So yes, they do work with Mayor Gloria and the behavioral health. They are part of the system now that is also providing services. We have other clubhouses as well in San Diego County. And so yes, it is about what they always stood for, education, support, and advocacy. But they also now are doing the on the ground. They're hoping to touch, but that is one way, like they say, the homelessness. They do have one residential home. Actually, it was a person passed away that had started this home many years ago. It's in North County though, but she willed it to NAMI to say, continue this work. And it would be great, but what does it always take? Money. It's always about the money.
It's money, yeah. And it's also people being willing to have it in their own neighborhood.
Oh, yes. The NIMBYism is real. The NIMBYism is real. Yeah.
Recovery home, whatever.
Yeah.
It's nice, but just don't put it on my block.
Oh, yeah. And actually, where Pharaoh was just a few months ago, it was a very quiet little street, and they normally under what they call the ILF, the Independent Living Association, they are homes. They're not, facilities or big hotels.
Right.
They are home-like environments where they get hot cooked meals and so on. And the residents are, yes, of course, allowed to go and come, but they say, at night you got to turn the, you have to be in by a certain time. You can't be loud and just like you can't normally. So that is another solution. We do have those, but it's always not enough. There are a lot of, like I said, great things going on in San Diego, but it is not enough a lot of times.
So if you could wave a magic wand, it sounds like you would change the structure so that there could be that involuntary intervention early.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously more education ongoing to remove some of the stigma. Sounds like when you were in your own crisis point of like, hey, my kid needs help now, they're like, here, take this class. That you would recommend that for people, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
We'll definitely link to NAMI's website and those resources. What about the role of culture in the way that you respond to issues of mental health? Do you run into, depending on what community you're working in, different communities must have different reactions and understandings of mental health, I'd imagine, right?
Yes, absolutely. As in my role at NAMI, when I was the education director, there were 5 threshold languages. So whenever you had a contract with the county, you had to make sure you provided. So I got to work with many communities. Like we had a contract with a Vietnamese social services organization where the material was translated to be in there, and not just word for word. It was like culturally. It needed to be so to serve the Vietnamese community. We did it in Arabic. We have a large Chaldean population, especially in the East County. I worked with that agency. They were trained, and they wouldn't take a training from a peer. Remember, I told you the NAMI programs are peer-to-peer type training. They said, oh no, that person has to be a person who is a doctor or what. So because that's how they did that cultural piece. So that's how that one was taught for that Spanish. Of course, we did, Spanish population, we did it. And I remember that we were told, because it said 2.5 hours, and we would, we didn't have enough funding to, rent all these different places, because we used to have to do 20 classes a year and for the families, and another 15 classes for the peer community. Well, that was a lot of spaces going on for 8 and 12 weeks. And so we didn't have money to do that. So we would be at the mercy of like a church that would let us, or a community center, something that was free. Well, a lot of times we said, yes, this is a 2.5 hour class with a half hour for, clean up and set up and whatever. Well, and I remember one of the Spanish speaking facilitators said to me, they said, we talk. We have to talk. We have to have food. So we needed more time. So we knew we needed to add more time. So we always, addressed it in that way. So yeah, it was English, Spanish, Arabic, Vietnamese. And Vietnamese. That we had one more. Yeah, because the Arabic was for Chaldean, and that was more. Yeah, I know we said Vietnamese. Yeah, because I just remember. Yeah, maybe that was the 5, including English, of course. But that was the most. That was the best thing. I used to love to go to the graduations. As at the last class, of course, it was a big celebration. And we would go. Oh, it wasn't a threshold language, but older adults, just like my son now is in that category of an older adult living with serious mental illness. Yeah, he's it was really 50 and above, but he's almost there. And so we did a class that was geared towards that population. They have different needs. So that's cultural too. So, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating study of humanity, right? And the role of communities, the role of family. How has your younger son handled this? It's going to be an interesting balance at home, right?
Oh, yes,
To raise
yes.
to raise both your sons who you love each of them 100% of your being. But that's what it means to be a parent.
Yeah.
But they have different needs. And so did you ever find yourself looking to your younger son, oh man, I wish, we need to invest more time in you, but we have this kind of burning building over here.
Yeah. Yeah.
How does a family manage that?
We have talked about that recent. And one of the things that I'm glad that we did is he was too young to come to family. So everything we learned, we'd come home and tell him and talk to him. I wanted him to understand what was going on with his brother. Then he went out of state to college. And I remember when he came home, my son was still then living at the home with us. And he, as soon as he left, he just hit the bottom, and I said, oh, they picked. And I remember he was sitting in his dorm and he cried. And I hadn't seen my son cry since he was a little boy, something scraped his knee and I said, oh my God, I'm never going to tell him again when he's not doing well. It hurt him so bad. And they have a lovely relationship right now. But when he was younger, I remember he played all kind of sports and whatever. So my husband would go that way with him. I would be over here trying to do whatever. And I remember he said, and I asked him, because I remember that our former CEO of NAMI wrote a book actually about the siblings. She was a sibling, and she wrote a book, and she was interviewing siblings of individuals. And I remember he said, I just remember you weren't at a lot of my games on Saturday. And that kind of, Dad, I know Dad was there, but you weren't there, So I did. It did take away. And I'm so glad you asked me that, because a lot of times I'll go through this story, so I make sure that even in my presentations, I have family pictures. I said, yeah, I have another son, who's a great guy, and I want to talk about him some, a little bit as well. So I always try to remember that, yes, that there is another son, another family member, immediate family member that's also has lived this. In his adult years, he has gone to clean out hotel rooms, motel rooms, apartments, went to the streets. And I remember when he first came home, he was working downtown, and he said, Mom, where he lived, he would ride the trolley to work. And he said, I left earlier today because I wanted to stop at my bank and get some money before I, went in. And I get off at the stop earlier, and then I just walked the rest of the way. He said, literally in a crosswalk. And he looked and he said, Pharaoh, it was his brother. I said, but God, I'm a spiritual person. I said, that's God, and he said, yeah, he'd been out there homeless at that time. And he said, come over here, and he said, we sat down, and he said, let me call Mom. Come on, let me get you some help. Pharaoh's wrapped in the blankets, and he said, people out here look out for me. He said, so I gave him some money. And I just can't imagine what the rest of his walk was, that day. But he's had to live through this right along with us. He loves his brother. And when he's doing well, when I see them together again, talking about sports and movies and women and,
Right.
just everything, and the laughing. And sometimes I see the dynamic change. He's the older brother. Come on, Pharaoh, I'm going to take you some food. I'm going to bring you this. I'm going to do this. And then when he's well again, I watch it go through, because Pharaoh's very thoughtful and very, when it comes to, sometimes I even found myself, he says, well, Mom, this, and I said, you know what? I never thought of it that way. So he's got a very good And I can see it switch back where the younger son is getting advice from his older brother again about life stuff, So, but I see it go like this, the dynamic of who's sort of it's.
Does Pharaoh have well, I know you talked about the lack of self-awareness. That's a medical
Yes.
condition. Does he have an understanding of his biological fathers?
Yes. During because after he left our life, I didn't know what happened to him for 27 years until he died.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We found out that he died because he did leave part of his, he left his, what it was left of his military, whatever, to him. That was a shock. They didn't know how to find my son because they had our address up in Northern California, but eventually they found him. And I was like, who is this? Somebody died. My husband was like, because he worked for the government, he said, that's federal government life insurance. That's how we knew that he died. But it's been in the last 10 years. Oh, and part of this story too, and this is another God part, it was about 15 years, of this journey with Pharaoh. I did a talk at just a little class or something, and a person followed me out of the class, and she said, I help veterans get their discharges upgraded. And I said, yeah, I've heard that you can do that, but gosh, every time they just give us a file, she says, no, it's my job. That's what I do. And so I had that transcript. I had all of his stuff that I kind of held on to that wasn't lost. And Pharaoh I gave him my favorite office supply is a sheet protector. My Pharaoh put it all in there and in a big binder. We handed her that binder. It took her a year and a half. He got his bad conduct discharge upgraded to a 100% disabled veteran. So he now has a source of income. He can receive his services at the vet VA hospital. He can shop at the commissary. This was just a great, and still, and he was again doing well. Like I said, he has these periods. It could be 3 to 5 years of maybe doing, but in recent years, for some reason, he's just
shorter cycles.
Yeah, shorter cycles. And he says it's the side effects of the medication, which are horrible. I mean, one of them even had a commercial about that medication, the lawyers, if you've been taking this medication, it makes men grow breasts, so who wants to stay on a medication that does that, or he said, you just feel sedated all the time. You just feel, I don't have any energy. I don't, and I can't imagine. And you have to take that basically the rest of your life. Yes, there are long-acting injectables, which make it like you don't have to remember the pills every night. But that has the same side effects in a lot of ways. And then one of them is tardive dyskinesia. You see the commercial on TV for the medication now that can help with the tardive dyskinesia. They didn't have that. Well, it's involuntary movement. You sit there and your face is twisting up or whatever, So you can't imagine, that having to live some of those side effects is not just like waiting, something like erectile dysfunction, all these things that come along with that medication. So yeah, you might stop it, but again, only I think a person because there are many people that stay on them, in spite of all those things, but a person with the anosognosia feature, that still is difficult.
Well, you've been so generous with your time and your story and your openness and candor about your family. It's very touching, reflecting on and listening to you, these moments when serendipitous things happen in your life. One of them being running into this woman who devotes her time to getting benefits figured out and discharges figured out for veterans and other experiences that you've had. I have one last question for you before we get there. Do you have anything that has been kind of kicking around in your head that we have not yet touched on in this conversation you think would benefit us?
No, I would just want to leave them with, even if you don't have, I mean, you probably do. The statistic is 1 in 5. Yeah. People there's some form of it around you. Is be the casserole person. Even if it's for the family.
That's a great T-shirt, right?
Yes, yes, and also, if someone is having to say, I don't understand it, but I can listen. Or I can take you for a cup of coffee, not maybe the individual or the family member just kind of going through it. And there's even an education program. It's called Mental Health First Aid. And it's just for the general public to understand what mental illness is and is not, I always say. So I would just say to have a more open mind about it. We don't want anyone to go up and say, oh, that guy's struggling. Let me go over there and try to help him. No, we don't want you to do that. But just kind of have an open mind and an understanding about it. And if you want, educate yourself. There's a lot on the internet now as well. But make sure you get it from a good source. Yes.
So the last question is a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. So let's say you're given the opportunity to create a billboard on the side of the freeway. Mm. What does your billboard say to the world about the journey that has become your work, that has become your life? What do you want the public, as they're driving by, wrapped up in their own minds and their own worlds, what do you want them to, other than be the casserole person?
I would want to have a message about that mental illness is a treatable medical condition. That's what I would want to say, that it is not a person that just needs to shake it off and get it together or whatever. It takes treatment. And so just to remind people, it's a treatable medical condition. The definition of mental illness is, this is a fact sheet. It's longer than what I'm about to say. But it says mental illness is a medical condition that disrupts a person's thinking, feeling, and ability to relate to others and daily functioning. Just that sentence right there is what I always start within my presentations as well, because I want to remind people that it is a medical condition. So that's probably what my billboard would say. And on a personal, I would probably say 25 years later and I'm still standing. That would be for my personal one.
Thank you so much for your time and wisdom and energy and your hope in the midst of challenges. It's really inspiring. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting.
Yes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hangout Podcast. To support our show, please click the Support Our Show link. If you choose to make a donation, it's much appreciated. Any amount, however small, will make a difference. I want to emphasize as well that this show is entirely private and separate from my day job, and as such, all opinions and views expressed herein are mine and mine alone. Thank you for coming on in to hang out.